With degrees in criminal justice and ethics, over 30 years of investigative experience, a recognized expert in investigation procedures, and an expert in criminal and social behaviors, I am Rick Decker, and this is A Shadow of Truth. Greetings from St. Charles, South Carolina. Listen, before we get off into this podcast today, I want to tell everybody I'm very grateful for the emails that I was getting when I was sick. Some people had even checked to see if I had passed away, and then coupled with almost 12,000 downloads since October when we started this thing. I'm just humbled and overwhelmed, and for each and every one of you and all of your concerns. So, thank you. Before we get started here, I want to also address some other emails that I've gotten questioning what I do for a living, if I still do investigations and cold cases and stuff. And the answer to that is no. I no longer do investigative work except investigative work that is associated with the fire department in my volunteer position, because I'm a government investigator, and doing any other type of investigation would obviously be a conflict. This podcast, A Shadow of Truth, is my fun time podcast. This is what I do for fun because I like looking into the psychological profiles of serial killers, and I like talking about them. My day job, however, is I am a cognitive behavioral coach, and I have people that I coach and help them change behaviors and start thinking better throughout their lives. And in fact, at the end of this month, I'm going to air another podcast called the Think Better podcast, but that's going to be exclusively on Rumble. So let's get into the show today. We are talking about Amelia Dyer, the Ogress of Reading. I will warn you on Amelia that she is what they call a baby farmer. So if you are easily troubled by the discussion or the images of vulnerable children coming to their end, don't listen to this podcast, because that's basically what we're talking about today. So, Amelia, she was born in 1837 to Samuel and Sarah Hobley. She was part of 5 children. Her father was a shoemaker. Although her childhood was marred with mental illness, her mother lived with a process called typhus. It was a type of fever that was caused by bacterial infection, and it was spread by fleas. And Amelia was privy to her mother's violent fits. I mean, there were just one right after the other. And because she was the middle child, so to speak, Amelia had to take care of her mom until she passed away. There was other stress in Amelia's life. I mean, the drama is just ridiculous. There was an illegitimate sibling who was not accepted by the family, but then later on accepted by the family, and it found out it wasn't a sibling, it was her grandfather's illegitimate child. I mean, the family dynamics are beyond more than messed up. I mean, I've seen some crazy crap in my years, but that one kind of really took the cake. As things go, Amelia married a man eventually by the name of George Thomas. He and she were kind of shady, I guess. They had lied on their marriage certificate to reduce the age gap. He had reduced his age by 11, and she reduced her age by 6 years. I don't know why. Maybe it was a thing back in the Victorian area. But anyway, after they were married, Dyer trained as a nurse. After meeting a woman during midwifing events, her name was Ellen Dane, Dyer learned of a better way to make an income, and Dyer needed more money when she met um, Dane because her husband, George, had passed away and left her almost destitute. So a number of years had um, passed between her happy years of being married with George and to what led her to needing a better or greater income to survive. Back in this time, income opportunities were limited to women, particularly single women and women who weren't married. And um, Amelia's husband had passed away, and Dane had introduced her to what was commonly called as baby farming. Today, it would have been simply been referred to as an orphanage or a home for wayward children. But back then, it was simply baby farming. Now, how it worked it was a consequence of a woman who was pregnant and unwed would require lodging because there would have been no one to take care of her. And being an unmarried mother back in the Victorian era often resulted in a struggle to gain income. And even societal constructs were against women in that era in that situation. They had passed a law called the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, which removed any financial obligation from the fathers of illegitimate children. The act provided that the father could still be allowed to raise his legitimate children, while all along the illegitimate child and the estranged mother stayed in poverty. And at this time, the stigmatism of such a relationship was at its peak. And it was as such to where in society they were shunned. The thing I want you to remember here at this point is that to add insult to injury, these mothers of these illegitimate children were still expected to pay a fee for services rendered at the baby farmhouse. So, what had happened is that these women had meager means to pay, and they would pay, and knowing that they could not take the child because they could not pay for the services that were rendered, many of the mothers just left, leaving the children with the nurse to be adopted out. And this is why they called it baby farming, because the crop would come in and then the nurse would essentially seek foster care parents or parents that were willing to adopt a child made from illegitimate means. When the baby was left with the nurse was then the legal agent of the child and allowed the nurse to adopt the child out or set it up for foster care services, where the child was given to a family until a suitable home became available or the mothers returned, were able to pay the fees owed and be able to take their child with them. Now, these nurses made money on the front end and the back end. Not only were they charging the mothers, but if they found out that the father of this illegitimate child was, well off to say, they would extort money from the father on a weekly or monthly basis to keep it quiet that he had an illegitimate family out in society so his reputation would not be tarnished. And these men would pay. So not only were these nurses making money from these women who really were in dire straits, but they were making money on the back end from the illegitimate, from the father of the illegitimate child, and then they would make money in the middle when they adopted the child out. As one can imagine, people see a vulnerability and they take advantage of it. And this practice among um, these boarding homes where they were called baby farmers, and these nurses were doing it all over the country. It was, I don't want to say an epidemic, but it was really a common practice for all of these baby farming institutions to make money in the manner that we just described. As one can imagine, that the cash flow eventually started to dry up because babies typically would have gotten older, um, and be harder to hide. And then people that are being extorted really don't want to keep paying the piper and get to a point where they just don't care anymore. So the practice was drying up. Women, these nurses were being left all these children to raise and adopt out with minimal income. The thing I need you to understand is that this was common practice in Victorian England. So you figure one community that would have two, maybe three of these baby farming homes, taking in all these children from the surrounding area. It must have been a heyday on getting income from these fathers that wished to remain in the dark, so to speak. So when the money started drying up, the common practice then became to not adopt these children out. No, 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 no. It was to starve these children to death. That's right, you heard me. They would starve these children. And the babies that made too much noise or they thought would end up eventually being more high profile, so to speak, were gently sedated with a brew called a mother's friend. It was a concoction usually made up of some type of alcohol or other prescription drugs, but most often it was opium. Sadly, babies were killed by starvation more than overdose. And I say that sadly because starvation is a hell of a way to go. And at least if the ones that were overdosed were, I hate to say the term, and I don't mean it in the way that it's going to come out, more humane. And no life taken is ever taken humanely. But for infants that are crying for their mother's milk and want to live, poisoning them and overdosing them was by far better than letting that little life go hungry until it became lifeless. And I don't know many of you, if you know, that starvation does not happen quickly. It's weeks, months before the end comes. So at this point, you must be saying, well, okay, if this was common practice and it was going on, why the hell are we talking about Amelia Dyer? Well, I'm going to tell you why. Because Amelia, believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, was accredited for killing more than 400 babies and children. That's right, babies and children. Children that made it into the toddler years that were with her. They only were able to confirm 6 deaths, but they attributed over 400 to 600 to her. So, how did Amelia get caught? Well, for people like Amelia, the overdose and starvation was, I guess, an open doorway because it allowed them to gain quick income, but at the same time, officials were not the best either. They would, coroner's office or the doctor that would come would deem that the death was a lack of mother's milk, starvation due to the lack of milk, or a deficit of birth. Now, you got to remember way back when record keeping was not really the high priority in any society. Hell, I can tell you right now, I have met people in my lifetime that were born 80, 90 years ago, and particularly like in Arizona, West Texas, etc., where their birth certificates are non existent. Barry Goldwater could not run for president because at the time he died, or was born rather, Arizona was not a state. It was a territory. So, I mean, you have to put things into perspective when you start looking at the dynamics of a society. I had questioned myself for a number of days on if I was going to do this particular podcast. And as a scholar, I thought that I had an obligation to do the podcast because if we shun away from the stuff that makes us uncomfortable, we are doomed to repeat it. And even though that this is an uncomfortable podcast, even for me, I mean, I've investigated many children's deaths as a consequence of homicide and as a consequence of SIDS during my coroner and my investigative years. And even as a fire investigator, I've run into situations where a child is taken from this world. But if we do not focus on the most heinous of crimes behind us, when we don't see them and we forget about them, at some point we're going to repeat it. So anyway, Amelia, she ran for a while. She changed her name because what had happened is she got caught, and the coroner at that time took a good look at how many people or children had actually died. Now, if you remember in her house, and if you remember that this is kind of when we talked about Dr. Harold Shipman, he was kind of caught the same way. A coroner, another doctor who was a part of oversight, saw that a lot of his patients were being were dead and were being written off as mysterious deaths or as a consequence of overdose. And the same thing happened with Amelia. And Amelia's business went downhill because her husband, George, I believe was the man's name, died. Okay, and so as any individual knows that once your spouse goes, you need to make up that income. Now, Amelia eventually remarried a man named William Dyer. They had children, and Amelia got tired of him and left her husband. And it was speculated that it was during this time where her need for money became too much of a demon for her. And she was previously, I think, in her own mind, trying to conduct a legitimate business. But knowing the dynamics of the baby farming industry, she took advantage of that. And the business took a turn for the worst. Now, putting things into perspective here, before we get too much further into Amelia and her life, I just want to remind everybody that serial killing is really a manifestation of the 20th century. The term wasn't even created until around 1970s, and it was in a report written by a young man by the name of Robert Ressler. And even from that, it wasn't until the 1980s that the FBI defined serial killing as the act that we know today, killing of 3 or more victims. Originally, the term was a person who kills serially in succession, each a continuation of the kill before. That was the term. And now I'll dig more into this term and why it is a manifestation of the 20th century in my book coming up later on this year. We'll talk about that later on towards the end of the show. But Dyer had had some hard times. She had spent time in a mental institution for a variety of issues. Instability and suicidal tendencies were at the top of that list. Now, it was noted during trial that these mental breakdowns, if you will, tend to coincide with when she was having trouble or trouble was coming her way. And since she worked as a nurse in a mental hospital during her training years, she knew how mentally ill patients act. And certain people, prosecutors, lawyers, thought that her episodes were a convenience, and other than her real issue being that she had become addicted to alcohol and opioids over her lifetime. So Dyer, like many other baby farmers, learned that farming was expensive. She paid money out to foster families for food, medical care. Expenses had to be astronomical at the time. Okay. And Dyer did the thing that she was supposed to do. She was required to report the deaths. And that's, like I said, how she got caught is because the doctor at the time thought, well, there are a little too many deaths of little ones here. Even with that, Dyer was not convicted of murder, but she was convicted of 1 count of neglect and given 6 months of hard labor. Where, if you remember Harold Shipman, when he got caught through his array of governmental disorder, he got hands slapped and went to and from different medical institutions, but eventually ended up in prison. Dyer wasn't restricted when she got that conviction from baby farming. So once she got out, she went right back to work, except she decided now she wasn't going to report these deaths. She quit using the doctors and, in the cloak of darkness, started disposing of these victims, these children, alongside the river or in the river. She would bury them, but most of them she dumped into the river. And she started to change her name and change locations frequently because, you start dropping dead bodies off, eventually people are going to take notice. And that's exactly what happened. Dyer was caught because one of the children she disposed in the famous river was tracked back to her after combing through many of her aliases. And how, for this era, they did this is remarkable. Police used new technology called microscopic technology. And so basically, they looked at the wrapping underneath the microscope to decipher what was written on the wrapping. And the box was not weighted other than the baby's weight, and it didn't sink. So they were able to read the wet ink off the package, which led police back to Dyer's home. Now, they didn't have any evidence on her other than that. So they tried to send in a decoy, and the woman is supposed to ask Dyer for services as a pregnant mother. But when the woman showed up and Dyer opened the door, there were the police at the doorstep waiting for the woman to go in. It was like they didn't understand undercover operations back then. So when the police finally were able to raid Dyer's home, not a single infant or child was found. However, the stench was unbearable. They did find enough circumstantial evidence, telegram tape or tape for boxes, telegrams discussing adoption, pawn tickets for children's clothing, letters from mothers asking about their left behind child's well-being. The circumstantial evidence was really stacked against her. So on May 22nd, 1896, Dyer appeared before the magistrate and pled guilty to one murder. Her only defense was insanity. Now remember, she spent time in a mental institution, and the prosecutor at the time argued that it was just circumstance, that she really wasn't mentally ill. Well, the jury believed him and took only 4.5 minutes to convict her. She was hung on June 10th, 1896. In her cell, they found 5 books, exercise books, is what they said, with Dyer's handwriting, complete confessions of the murders that she did. And it's the only record of the murders that she did. Was Dyer insane or not? Prosecution didn't think so. I don't either. In our earlier shows, we spoke of why women kill, and we found that it is out of some sort of effort to ease the person's pain, out of love or affection and or greed, which Dyer met all that criteria. Other times they are partnered with a male figure that is more domineering and in control. Now, there was some speculation that her children were involved, but they were never prosecuted. I believe that Dyer had been motivated by the caring aspect, since, I mean, she was a nurse. And I believe that Dyer initially started this thing in good faith, but I also believe that because of the events in her life and how she was, I believe that she is a good example of what we call malignant narcissism, where she had traits of antisocial behavior, but also had a sadistic streak in her, and that is exhibited by the manner of how she killed and disposed her victims, which leads me to the type killer she was. I mean, serial killing wasn't a concept back then. Her methods were sadistic. She starved the child to death and poisoned them, ultimately wrapping a piece of tape around their neck, where she had indicated to police before her death that that tape was the mark of how she knew it was one of her children that they found. And so we have to ask, were there not 2 victims with each killing of a child. In the aftermath of these killings were women who trusted her and expected Dyer to properly care and adopt that child. There was a woman that loved that child. After all, Dyer herself advertised that she was an upstanding member of society. She convinced these mothers and foster families and adoptive families that she took care of these children and that they were in good condition. Knowing that, I surmise that Dyer is not only sadistic or was sadistic, she was a power control type killer. She had ultimate control over the most vulnerable victim and a socially distraught mother who could not do anything about it because nobody knew that she had given birth. Simply put, she became greedy. The need for money and the easy way she had in disposing of children was the catalyst for her motivation to do what she did the way she did. Okay, that's the show for today. I want to thank everybody for listening. I am, again, grateful for the emails. Let me note, I don't remember if I said this earlier in the show, that if a situation ever does arise that I do pass, there's a contingency plan. My wife and or either my business colleague up in New York would actually do a show, letting all my listeners know. Don't forget to rate the show. Comments, concerns, suggestions, shadowtruthpodcast@gmail.com. Also, remember that at the end of March, I will have on Rumble my new podcast that's more focused towards my coaching business. It is called the Better Thinking Podcast. I can't stress this enough. We're in a society right now that is full of hate, and it's easier to hate than it is to love. Please take care of one another. Stay safe. Thanks for listening. Carpe diem.